Juan from Peking University. You probably have read my background, correct? So you have no problems with that. So as a professor, you can call me Bruce. All right? A little bit, I've taught for 30 years. I've been doing business in China since 1985. I had my own practice until 2000, and then I was of counsel to a Chinese law firm called Albright out of Shanghai, one of the three largest law firms. I was senior of counsel to the international group, and then in 2004 invited to teach at Peking University, where I've been hopefully gradually descending from a very intense law career to raising a family and enjoying life. Does anybody have any questions after having read my bio, and do you have any questions about what we're going to try to do here in this class? My idea is after about 20-25 minutes you guys go brain dead. So if you are feeling like you're going brain dead, let me know, and we'll take a short break. I'm envisioning taking a break maybe halfway through the class. Does that work for everybody? Okay. Okay, what we're going to try to do here is that you're all students, correct? And you all are looking for information that you can utilize as you go on your way, either applying for a position, either as an attorney or as a consultant, or just getting a general idea of what Chinese law is all about. I've written up here information plus knowledge. All of you know that we are in the age of information, and there's so much information that's coming at you so quickly that you need a way to systematize it. You need a way to put that into a framework that you can then use to be able to sell yourself or the product which you want to provide to a client. That requires knowledge. Knowledge of the system that you want to operate in. And you're here because you want to know a little bit about Chinese law. Let me just start off by saying, in the West, it's generally the past plus the present will predict the future. What do I mean by that? I mean there's a degree of certainty here with the legal system of the West. That means you can predict what the outcome will be of any contract that you enter into, correct? In China, it's different. I'm going to try to tell you about the past, which hopefully will give you some sense of the future, which then will allow you to explain to a client what the present climate is in which that client wants to do business in China. Is everybody clear on that? Everybody understand that? Okay? Let me start by giving a little background, because this is before your time. It's actually before my time. After World War II, the term Third World was coined. And Third World described those countries which were developing. And there were three terms that they talked about when you studied the countries. Those terms were modernization, development, and democracy. Okay, keep those in mind, those three terms. Now, after the Cold War in 1989 ended, you guys remember the Cold War? Or was that before your time as well? Okay. Cold War was when the Soviet bloc essentially collapsed. At that time, then they started talking about three other terms: globalization, market economy, and civil society. Okay, so keep those six terms in mind, okay? Because they will all be used in the discussion that we will have over the next 2 weeks. Again, modernization, development, democracy, globalization, market economy, and civil society. Okay, now, it's common knowledge that on one hand, the Western countries, particularly the European countries, which had former colonies, some of you are from the former colonies of the Western countries, encourage their colonies, or their ex-colonies, to emulate the Western model to achieve modern economic development. Okay, stop and think about that. Okay, India, Singapore, countries in Africa. On the other hand, there were countries which achieved national liberation, that is, after they became ex-colonies. And they opted for the other existing model, which was what? The socialist model. Okay? As an alternative to realize the goal of economic modernization. Now, as you all know, both models failed. They were either found unfit by the ruling elite of the developing countries in Africa, Asia, and South America, or they were crushed by the West through their organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. So over 4 decades of experimenting with modernization theory as prescribed by the West and these politically elite, a large number of developing countries today, stop and think about it, have developed in their underdevelopment, which has contributed to more people without jobs, widespread poverty, corruption, and institutionalized crime. Those are all endemic now in the developing countries. The realization of this is that there's no single model which is good for all nations, and that each nation has to follow their own political, social, historical, and cultural conditions. So there's only one viable way to chart their own model for development, and that model is not a carbon copy of anybody else's model. This is exactly what the PRC realized in 1978. And so 30 years ago, they embarked on this bold, radical, and pragmatic restructuring. Now, any way you look at it, China, or the Chinese experiment, cannot be branded as either a typical socialist model of transformation, nor can the approach be said to have taken socialism and cast it to the wind. So how has the Chinese leadership been able to do this? They've been able to devise, with theoretical finesse, an ideological justification for what it calls socialist modernization with Chinese characteristics. Okay? Keep that in mind too. Because what we're talking about and what we will talk about in the next 2 weeks is what? Socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics. Now, as of today, China has integrated herself into the we call the mega circulation of the world economic development. stop and think about what the world economy looks like today. At the apex, at the top of the world economy, is high technology. And then below high technology, you have this vast, intensive base of manufacturing. Now, this manufacturing base is gradually being eliminated from the Western countries, correct? The industrialized countries. Singapore is eliminating the labor-intensive consumer goods in favor of high technology, correct? The United States is doing the same thing. You stop and think about the proliferation around the world of what they call high-tech parks, whether it's in Ireland, whether it's in Singapore. Everybody's looking to set up high-tech parks. This is the rhythm of today's world economic development that China understands very, very well. Now, even in a developing country like China, and China calls itself a developing country, you can acquire high tech. And so, for example, if you look at Xi'an, you have a company from the United States which is setting up a $1 billion DRAM facility in China. You have IBM coming here. You have Intel. You have Microsoft. So you can acquire that. You don't need to compete with the advanced countries because the advanced countries are coming to China. So this persistent demand for consumer goods and for high tech is what China has used to leverage itself into the enviable position of being one of the captains of the financial world. Okay. And that financial world is the underpinning for what we call globalization. The movement of money influences the movement of goods and development. So we go from what Mao used to call self-reliance to now self-reliance as defined by socialist modernization in China through Deng Xiaoping as using what? Using foreign funds, foreign direct investment, and technology to achieve its position right now. Now, even the experts in China understand that with this inflow of FDI and technology comes a heavy cost. And what is that heavy cost? The heavy cost is the potential weakening of the state and eventually of the political control slipping out of the hands of the Communist Party. If they were to fully succumb to the outside pressures that come along with this model. So what has China's party elite done? They have made it absolutely clear that the role of the state in China's economic development strategy is paramount. And what has this caused in the West? It has caused considerable alarm. China has itself, as you all know, Deng Xiaoping talked about China becoming a mid-level advanced industrial nation by the year 2050. Most people say that will occur in 2030, 20 years before that. And some people in the West, commentators, have called that year doomsday for the West. Because at that point, then, China will be in complete control, they believe, of the economic strings that run globalization. So, while the mainstream Chinese Western commentators continue to discredit the party's insistence on stability instead of bold political reform, that is, the call for what they believe is true democracy, in my opinion, they're making an error, because this contrasts with what I believe is a dominant mindset here in China, which is, while they will allow for political pluralism or multi-party democracy, it will be always under the leadership of the party. And you will notice, and one of the reasons why I signed the Constitution, in fact, did anybody who read the Constitution then go back and integrate in the amendments of the Constitution? Did anybody take this document and then amend all of the different sections? Okay. One of the sections that they amended was to include changing a key phrase to say that there would be multi-party participation, but under the leadership of the party. They've made that very clear in the preamble of the Constitution. So, where are we now? We're back here. What I mean we're back here is that we are in a country that is passing through a transitional phase. Any country that passes through a transitional phase deals with the downside of transition, which is grappling with problems of corruption, as you've seen in Chongqing with Bo Xilai, increasing crime, which everybody knows is happening, widening income disparity, which Premier Wen Jiabao and President Hu Jintao are trying to deal with, and the misuse of political power, which is the crackdown within the party itself. So it'll take time for all of this to occur, but in the meantime, here you are sitting in this classroom listening to me, trying to tell you, how am I going to be able to advise a client, given that we're in transition? And what you have to be able to say is, I understand and I know where China is going. And with that in mind, I will hopefully be able to tell you how you fit into doing business in China. Any questions? I come from a teaching system that encourages questions. Much different from the Chinese system, which discourages questions. I only learn about whether my theories and my interpretations are correct if you question them. So I invite comment and I invite questions. So if you are unclear or have a different take than what I have, you got to speak up. Okay? I had my first experience in 1986 at when I was guest teaching at Shanghai, Waimao Shuiyuan, and I asked the students, do you have any questions? And nobody had a question, so what I did was, I said, okay, you've got 2 minutes, and I'm going to start down this corner, and everybody's going to ask me a question. Scared the dickens out of them. But after about the third class, they got really comfortable, and we had a nice class because we were able to exchange ideas, because I don't know what you guys are facing. I don't know what the issues you want to know about. I don't know what you want to take this course for. So in the exchange of ideas, then I will get a better understanding, and then I can specifically talk about certain issues that you have some concerns about. Can we agree on that? Okay. Okay, now, you've got in front of you my slides, and that's going to give you kind of some general prompting of where I want to go in this discussion. Let me first, I think probably Maggie's the only one. Maggie is the only from China that probably understands what I'm going to talk to you about, because it's historical. But you need to have this as a background because you need to know where China was here. Okay? And I'm going to start by telling you that I believe, I've been practicing here since '85 to now, 25 years, that anything before 1949 is not really that relevant in terms of the laws of China. Most of the scholars in the West will focus on what they call the evolution of Chinese law, and they go all the way back to the Great Qing Code. Well, the Great Qing Code, as well as the Civil War period in the 20s and 30s, and even, I'm going to say, through right up to the beginning of 1949, none of that really is of importance to you as you address the role of the rule of law in China. So I'm going to start after the revolution in 1949. In 1949, the leaders abolished all of the KMT laws that were in existence in China. And what they established initially was what we call, or what they call, the Common Program. A statement of national purposes under the Provisional Constitution in September of 1949. And under this Common Program, there were 148 mainly experimental or provisional laws and regulations intended to establish the new socialist rule of law system. Okay? At the same time, they established a 3-level single appeal court system and a what we call prosecutorial, they called procutorate. I have a hard time pronouncing that. Are you guys all familiar with that word? It's Procuratore. That's the prosecutor. Okay? Okay, now after 1949, after they put these laws in place, the legal work was carried out by a handful of Western-trained specialists and a large number of legal cadre that were trained in China. And from the very beginning, these two groups disagreed over legal policy. And the development of the legal system reflected their continuous debate over both the form and substance of the socialist rule of law system. The Western-trained specialists, the KMT-era lawyers who cooperated with the new government, were considered politically unreliable. And so the party initially ignored most of their arguments for a modern legal system. As the 1950s progressed, however, this group was instrumental in the China's adoption of a legal system based on the system of the Soviet Union. what these specialists argued for was a codified legal system enforced by strict Soviet-style legal bureaucracy. They felt that without these procedures, there would be too much arbitrariness. And eventually, the legal system would become ineffective. They felt that if you allowed too much discretion and arbitrary decisions, that it's not going to work. Now, after Stalin died in 1953, and you have to realize that one of the keys to China being the little brother of Russia at that time was Mao's admiration for Stalin. After Stalin died in 1953, Khrushchev started to move away from the Stalinist policies. And most troubling to Mao was the de-emphasis of the core of Marxist-Leninism. And the idea that inevitably there would be a war between capitalism and socialism. Okay? By de-Stalinizing the USSR, Khrushchev was also dissolving the condition that had made the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship in 1950 attractive to China. And they were no longer willing, in Mao's mind, to guarantee to support China if there was a war between China and the U.S. Okay? You think about this in the context of the Korean War. Okay. And that's why China came so vigorously to the aid of North Korea. By 1959, the roots of the ideological split were confirmed. And as you know, or may not know, Mao was afraid that Soviet Union was going to invade China. And so the legacy of that is today, if you go to Xi'an, for example, you will find a great number of the technical institutes of China located in Xi'an. For example, Jiaoda Xi'an is there. Jiaoda, people think Jiaoda Shanghai, but actually Jiaoda Xi'an is more important, or Jiaotong University. You have all the technical institutes there. You also have the space program is up in Xi'an. That's because all of these universities and research institutes were once located in Beijing, and Mao was fearful that all of that would be wiped out if the Soviet Union destroyed Beijing. And so, as a precautionary measure, he moved a lot of the main institutes to Xi'an. Okay. Now, so what happened to that Soviet-style legal system that China had adopted? Well, in addition to the split between the USSR and China and Mao's continuing disillusionment with the USSR, there were also internal issues within China that contributed to the abandonment of that particular style of system. In 1956, Mao launched the mass movement called Let 100 Flowers Bloom. Remember that? That was designed to diffuse the situation that was occurring in Hungary and Poland. Remember the uprising in 1956 in Hungary? So Mao said, we welcome everybody to talk about their concerns about China. Now, who seized upon that? The legal specialists, these Western-trained legal specialists. And they criticized the party and government policies. They complained that there were too few laws and that the National People's Congress was slow in enacting those laws that had already been drafted. They also felt that the legal institutions were slow in maturing and that poorly qualified cadre were obstructing the work of these institutions to, no surprise, to suit their own political aims. And they also spoke out against those, especially party members, who thought themselves above the law. So by August of 1957, the criticism of the party and the state policies were too broad and penetrating to be ignored. And so Mao and his supporters labeled these critics rightists and launched a campaign against them. So these victims, these specialists in their legal system, they became the first to be subject to the wrath of Mao. Now, he objected to the legal system they were pushing for several reasons, among them his views that the Soviet model was too westernized now for China. And that, for his own reasons, the judicial system was too constraining, too limiting. Now, interestingly enough, part of the proposals from these specialists at that time, in 1957, called for a judiciary free from party and political interference. And Mao denounced these ideas as ridiculous. He did not want a judiciary that stood as an impartial arbiter between the party and anybody else. At the same time, he also spurned the notion of presumption of innocence and that the law always act in the interest of the state and the people rather than the party. As a result, many of these specialists were transferred, given non-judicial jobs, and all work on the legal system stopped. At that time, the number of law schools dropped sharply, and most of the universities shifted their curriculum to more politically acceptable subjects. As you all know, then, in 1966, all the universities were closed, and all law schools closed down as well. And it wasn't until 1977, for example, at Peking University, that the law school reopened. So this anti-rightist campaign put an end to efforts that would have brought some degree of judicial autonomy and safeguards for the accused, and the country moved toward police domination. And by 1958, the police were empowered to impose sanctions as they saw fit. So the party gave low priority to courts, and many judicial functions were turned over to local administrative officers. Then we enter what we call the period of rule of man. Okay? So the rule of man really reached its peak during the Cultural Revolution. And some legal commentators call that the Maoist legal nihilism period. Nihilism. That is, the party leadership declared its power absolute in legal matters. And the mass line was, as it affected public order, advocating turning over an increasing amount of control and judicial authority over the masses, to the masses. This meant greater involvement and authority for the neighborhood committees and the grassroots mass organizations. And you will see remnants of that still existing in the mediation and arbitration system. Right, Maggie? You still have neighborhood mediation centers here in China that deal with issues of neighborhoods. Disputes between people, right? Between families in a neighborhood.
You mean cultural revolution?
No, now, today. You will still see there's mediation. The system of mediation is now neighborhood mediation. There's neighborhood mediation. There's low-level mediation and arbitration. That means family disputes or disputes between neighbors are worked out without going to court. Her English is not super great, and my Chinese is nil, so. But anyway, you still see remnants of that system here. Okay. Now, during this period of rule of man, according to the Chinese Communist ideology, the party controlled the state and created and used the law to regulate the masses, realize socialism, and to suppress counter-revolutionaries. Those are the three goals. And since it was the party's view that the law and legal institutions existed to support the party and state power, law often took the form of general principles and shifting policies rather than detailed and constant rules. And some of that legacy you see in today's laws. When people complain that the laws are too vague, there is a reason for that. Okay? Is everybody still with me? Okay? So, the party wrote laws in simple enough language that every individual could understand and abide by. And you will see remnants of that in the law. Some legal commentators will say that, in a very broad term, in a very general term, in Chinese law, it only specifies what you can do, and you can't do anything else. In Western law, it's what you can't do, and you can do anything else. Okay? What does that mean? Let me give you an example. In 1987, I was asked by the Higher People's Court in Shanghai to give a lecture on Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC in the United States. And I said to then Vice President Gu Nianzu, who was an old friend of mine, I said, Judge Gu, I said, there's no reason for me to lecture on the SEC, because in China, they tell you what you can do, and you can't do anything else. He thought for a moment, and he said, well, that's okay, you can still lecture on it. I said, the whole idea behind the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States was that the law says this is what you can't do, and you can do anything you want. So the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, steps in and tells you when you've crossed over in areas where you shouldn't be. It's a very simplified way of looking at it. But still, if you stop and think about it, use that when you look at the law. When you hear the people who will come in and talk about the laws that you're going to hear the next 2 weeks, the two things are I want you to focus on. Is that law vague? And what is your definition of vague? Is it because you come from a system that is specific? that says this is what you can't do. And there's a certain amount of vagueness in that, correct? And the second thing to think about is the idea of, well, does Chinese law only allow you to do certain things and you can't do anything else? Or will it allow you, when you counsel a client, to be able to provide options? Because many times here in China, you will talk to an attorney, and the attorney will say, "This is all you can do. You can't do anything else." In the meantime, you've got a client over here that says, "Give me my 5 options because I want to assess the risk." So how do you reconcile what is over here, which is this is all you can do, with a client who's used to the Western system that says, "Okay, I know what the law won't allow me to do, so tell me what I can do." Okay, that's a dilemma that you will have to deal with. Okay? But keep that in mind when you counsel a client, or when you go to an interview and you want to explain to them what you believe your value to that firm is going to be. Okay. Now, the other thing that Mao did during that period of time was that he maintained, not what he did, but what he believed. He maintained that the revolution was continuous. So he opposed any legal system that would constrain the revolution. Anything that would stop the revolution from going on. And so whereas in the West they talk about stability, Mao was interested in constant change, organic change. Things kept moving. Because he believed that from the contradictions in society came the relentless class struggle. That was the classic Marxism that he believed in, which he believed that the Soviet Union was abandoning, which caused a split between the Soviet Union and China. So in this atmosphere, the courts were instruments for achieving political goals. And the criminal law is a good example of a law that was used by the party to conduct class struggle. So the emphasis was always shifting, and new enemies were always identified in this class struggle. Okay? So as a result, again using criminal law as an example, Mao was reluctant to codify criminal law that later might restrain the actions of the party. So what do we have here? We have a political law for a legal system, a court system which is used for political purposes, and we also have administration of justice which is decentralized to the masses. Those are the keynote during this period. Okay? And so Mao was unconcerned that a person contesting the result of a group decision had nowhere to seek redress. So in those first 30 years of the People's Republic, that is from 1949 to 19 78. You had new legal cadres who were chosen more for their ideological conviction rather than legal expertise. And so, as an upshot of that, when you had the first courts, and you'll hear this complaint quite often in the early days when I started practicing, most of the judges were ex-PLA officers. They were from the People's Liberation Army. They had no legal training. And they were to pass judgment on cases that were brought before the court. And these people who were in those positions favored the Maoist system of social and political control. And that was what they made their decisions based upon. They regarded themselves as supervisors of the masses who subscribed to a common set of values as set by the party. Now, does everybody have the time? Where are we? June Christmas. You guys are out at 12? Okay. Okay, let me run over it a little more. Okay. I'm going to get now we're up to 1978. Does everybody now familiar with the short course of the history? Does it make sense to you now where things are coming from? Okay. Okay, I want to take you now up to the root of the contemporary legal system that you have on your. You have that somewhere? Should be at the beginning. Okay. Yeah, I'm only on the second page. Okay. Now, Mao died, as you know, in 1976. Okay. And shortly thereafter, less than a month later, the Gang of Four was arrested. And the government then took its first steps to set aside the 1975 Constitution and restore a pre-Cultural Revolution legal system. So in January of 1977, then Premier Hua Guofeng directed the legal experts to begin rebuilding the judicial institutions in the spirit of the 1954 Constitution. And during the fall of 1977, the PLA and the militia began turning over the responsibility for public security to the civilian sector. They had a lot of study groups then. And a theoretical study group from the Supreme People's Court affirmed that the courts and the public security organs were solely responsible for maintaining public order. And they called on the people to accept the views of the what they called superior authorities. As I said before, the law schools then reopened in 1977. And the government set out to reorganize completely all the judicial procedures and establish codes of criminal law, judicial procedure as soon as possible. So we get to the point of law-based governance. And this is what prompted the idea of law-based governance. If there is no law, on what basis does a state exercise power? If there is no law, on what basis does the state legitimately exercise power? That is, how do they punish offenses and regulate civil affairs? Okay? Civil affairs can be synonymous with what? civil society. Okay? That's where the term civil society will come from. Now, as you may know or do know, Deng Xiaoping was a prominent victim in those days of lawlessness during the Cultural Revolution. In fact, it was his son who was thrown out of a window during the Cultural Revolution, and that's why he then became the head of the disabled organization, because he was also a victim of the Cultural Revolution. Now, even before he assumed supreme power, which was a very fortunate stroke for China, he spelled out the urgent need for an impersonal, highly institutionalized system with a complete set of legal codes at the third plenum, PLENUM, in 1978. You don't have to copy this down, but I'm just going to read it a couple of times. To ensure people's democracy, we must strengthen our legal system. Democracy has to be institutionalized and written into law so as to make sure that the institutions and law do not change whenever the leadership changes or whenever the leaders change their views or shift the focus of their attention. The trouble now is that our legal system is incomplete, with many laws yet to be enacted. Okay. Now, you all had an opportunity to read the white paper that I recommended, or you will have an opportunity to read that. That is one of the key reasons why we have this development over the last 20 years of a law-based governance, or 30 years, from 1978. So after assuming supreme power in the People's Republic in the late 1978, Deng Xiaoping insisted that law, the reason why the law should exist. Remember now, he was a moderate compared to the traditional Marxists, and so you have to understand the struggle within the party itself. He said that law was essential to socialist modernization and to do what? To combat Mao's legal nihilism. His aim was to replace what was referred to as the rule of man by the rule of law. So he inaugurated the massive program to reform and restructure the legal system. And accordingly, as you know, the Constitution was revised, laws were codified, judicial organs were reorganized, and the academic discipline of legal studies was revived. So by the time of his death in 1997, much of the philosophical foundation for the Chinese legal system, which we're looking at today, was in place. Okay. Want to take a break here? Or you guys want to keep cruising through? Are you guys, is it... Want to take a break? Yeah. Okay, you guys still with me? Is this stuff helpful to you? This information?
Yeah.
Okay.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
So yeah, actually I intend to give a maybe welcome statement to all of the guys here.
You can do it.
Okay.
Welcome.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, welcome. Okay, hi guys. I am Christy, the assistant for lecturer today. So I would like to extend our sincere welcome on behalf of the Law Spirit. Extend a sincere welcome to all of you for your support to this program. Yeah, hopefully you're gonna like it, right?
I don't know. They give anonymous feedback on how I perform.
Anonymous feedback?
Anonymous feedback. That means I can't beat them if I find out who has gone thumbs down. Okay.
无名的。
对，就是他不知道是谁给的。
Okay, later, in your break time.
We're taking a break.
Okay, so you'll do this in the feedback later.
No, they'll do it probably when I'm out of the room and.
Yeah, that helps. Actually, our teacher also do this for us. Yeah, and also in the following maybe two weeks, the course of this program will cover some really marketable and hot issues nowadays in China. Yeah, wish you a very pleasant stay here. Okay, and please feel at home in this classroom.
I'd stay here because it's air conditioned.
Your air conditioned?
As opposed to outside.
There's no air conditioning inside.
No, it's air conditioning is perfect here.
Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe you can have some discussions, and we have some biscuits and coffee and tea outside this room. Yeah, this door. Yeah.
You guys can get up and wander around. And
yeah, just
if you're
relax.
both of you are chair.